This is kind of a special, a special panel entitled, Now What? The Future of Great Ape Conservation. What will the future bring for great apes, and how can mankind ensure their long-term survival? And we're honored to have four of the most accomplished and famous and engaging characters in great ape conservation. We have, from my left, Annette Lanjouw, who's the Vice President of the Arcus Foundation. We have Doug Cress, the Program Coordinator for GRASP. We have Russ Mittermeier, President of Conservation International and Chairman of the IUCN Primate Specialist Group and a primate ecotourist, he tells us. And we have Jane Goodall, of course, whose list of honors and accomplishments would take us most of the rest of the session, but hardly needs an introduction, except to say Jane must be the best friend the great apes ever had. She's the founder of Jane Goodall Institute, the UN Messenger of Peace, and both Jane and Russ are GRASP ambassadors working closely with Doug. How do you begin to summarize what's gone on here? Well, we sort of had our first beginnings of wrestling with those thoughts last night, and so many ideas and thoughts came out, it became clear that this is very difficult. I've only been here for the last sort of 2 days of the Great Ape Summit, but just what I've seen in those 2 days has been, by turns, sobering, inspiring, challenging. It's clear that there's an awful lot of work to be done to accomplish the protection of the great apes. But I felt that one way to start this session was, I'm going to say very, very little. I would like each of our four distinguished panelists to give a sort of brief overview of what you feel are the most important messages, as briefly as you can, please, to have emerged in the last couple of days. You know, if you had a chance to write that line on the little capsule that goes into space that tells distant worlds and future times what was concluded here, what would you say? And I'll start immediately on my left with Annette.
I think one of the first points that I think is a take-home from this is that conservation is not the exclusive domain of conservationists, and it requires a lot of different disciplines working together in order to achieve the goals. I also think that what we heard a lot about is that ape survival is not only contingent on the behavior of people in ape range states, but that their survival is also very much affected by the people in wealthy countries and by the companies coming from wealthy companies and countries and extracting resources, natural resources, minerals and timber and other resources from ape range countries. And it's the behavior of us as consumers that affects what happens to apes. And then I think the last bullet point that I would like to raise, one that I think is very important, is that conservation is incredibly complicated, and there are so many different issues coming together, and a single issue approach to conservation is never going to work. There is no one solution because there are so many different issues at play, and people will have to face up to the complexity of conservation. And I think in particular for the people in communications and media, they'll have to face up to the fact that it's complicated as well and not portray conservation as a single issue problem with single issue solutions.
Thank you very much. Doug?
Thank you very much. I think as we go through these points, a lot of them will sound sort of similar, and maybe it matters what we come at them from, which direction we come from. And before I ever got into conservation, I spent 20 years as a reporter. That's a communications field. That's where you need to tell stories, you need to reach out. This conference underscored for me how badly we need to tell our story better, and how much better we need to be at reaching audiences that we don't even remotely touch in this day and age. The world is moving incredibly fast right now, and we're being left behind as conservationists and as people that are interested in the natural world. Many of the sessions have reflected on that. I think a second point to me is we're playing at a different scale. This was brought up in countless discussions, but we're playing down here, and the world we're trying to compete in really exists up here. And you can see that in so many ways. If you saw Madison Vorva's presentation this morning in Field Notes, very emotional, and she was pointing out that Kellogg's is a company she's trying to change the palm oil practices of. Kellogg's has a $1 billion advertising budget per year. $1 billion. And all the collective financial might of everybody in this room does not equal that, I guarantee you. And that's just their advertising budget. So if we're going to influence companies on that scale, we need to begin to play at that scale as well. And a third point, I think, that is probably something far more personal for many of my friends who are scientists in the room, and I am definitely not a scientist. But you can't just be a scientist anymore. I think the days of being a field researcher or a field scientist are gone. You have to be part of a much larger machine that can keep your project alive and speak for you on levels that you can't possibly reach. And you yourself have to be more than someone dedicated to studying gorillas. You've got to be a communications expert, maybe a law enforcement expert, certainly a fundraiser. You've probably got to be a manager. You've got to be doing so many things, skills that don't come with a degree, I believe, in primatology. And that ability to multitask is going to be essential going forward.
Thanks very much. First of all, I want to say it's great to be back. I was here for the very first Jackson Hole Wildlife Film Festival 24 years ago, and I haven't been back since. This has been a wonderful summit. I've been particularly pleased with the amount of time dedicated to actual discussion and not just listening to talking heads. So really, I mean, congratulations to those of you who've organized it. We've seen many threats to great apes, and we've seen some of them on the increase, and we've also seen a lot of positive developments, and that to me has been a cause for optimism. So what do we do now? What next? From my perspective, the number one priority has to be protected areas. Without protected areas, we simply are not going to be able to maintain not only great ape populations, but other primates, biodiversity in general. And these areas are also critically important for the provision of ecosystem services that are essential for our own survival. We need more of them. We need better management of those that exist. We need to respect their boundaries. And we really need to, I think, see them as central to everything that we're trying to do to ensure the maintenance of biodiversity in general, and certainly great apes in particular. And here I'm not just talking about national parks and biological reserves, the traditional protected areas, but also what are now called ICCAs, Indigenous and Community-Owned Conservation Areas, which are taking on more and more importance. If you look at the targets, look at where we are right now, we're at 13% of terrestrial protected areas. The Biodiversity Convention's target, as of a couple of years ago, is 17%. But if you look at recent data on these indigenous and community-owned conservation areas, they may already be at 12 or 13% in addition. So I think a lot of the action and a lot of the growth over the next few years in protected area coverage is going to be through these community-owned areas. Which leads me into my second point, which is the essential involvement of and benefits to local communities. This has been repeated time and time again. It's absolutely essential, and we really need to focus on how we do that. As many of you know, I'm a big fan of ecotourism. It's a quick way of generating livelihoods and demonstrating to local communities the value of these ecosystems and the animals that are in them. Yes, mountain gorilla approaches won't work perfectly everywhere. Every single place has to be dealt with based on its own realities. But I'll tell you, the mountain gorilla tourism program is a pretty damn good model. It's pretty impressive. And as many of you know, I'm making a major effort now to promote primate ecotourism and primate life listing and primate watching as a major competitive sport. I also want to highlight within that context the great importance of research presence. Whenever you have a research station, a field study site that goes for a long period of time, it provides probably the best protection imaginable. And if we could get more research stations, if we could get research stations into every critically important forest out there for great apes and other primates, it would be a real plus. And the third point that I want to make is that we have to ensure that both governments and corporations keep to their stated commitments. Most countries have pretty good legislation. Most of them are signatories to the Biodiversity Convention, CITES, Convention on Migratory Species, Climate Convention. We just need to hold them to their commitments. And the Biodiversity Convention, I think, is particularly important in that regard. The commitments are often very sound, but when you go out into the field and see what's going on, it's a very different reality. Same for corporations. A lot of corporations have good rhetoric, but the delivery on the ground is often pretty weak, and it drives me crazy when a multi-billion-dollar company says, oh, we have budget constraints, we can't come up with a few tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now, I have a suggestion that one of the outcomes I would like to see coming out of this conference in relation to oil palm in particular, which I see as the greatest threat, but I'll leave that for a little later.
Okay. Jane.
Okay, well, as we knew, the person who went last would have had many of their thoughts and outcomes already expressed. And there isn't a single person who's spoken who I don't agree with. But there nevertheless are one or two more things. And first thing I'd like to say, you started off by saying that you were here at the first Jackson Hole Film Festival. And what I want to say is what's really impressive to me, having been to many conferences about great apes, is that the initial ones, they were basically just researchers. And now we have this great diversity. And even if all the players aren't in this room and at this time, we completely understand the need to involve people from industry, from government, from the private sector, the local communities, research and conservation. We understand that. And that's beginning to happen, and that's reflected, and that's tremendously important. And I couldn't be more happy than to see that that's beginning to happen at a meeting like this. And maybe the next one, we'll have some of these, you know, big corporations sitting here who have become, okay, so to get them here, to get them around the table, to get them to do what you want them to do, Russ. And to follow along what you were saying, Doug, with, you know, the need to communicate. For me, the only way to reach some of these big players is through stories and getting to their heart, and nothing can do that better than film and media. So tying up the Great Ape Conference with the Jackson Hole Film Festival, to me, is absolutely perfect. And I know some of you saw, when Richard and I were talking, you saw the chimpanzee Wanda when she's released and she comes and embraces me. Well, that's going to move people. It's going to move people because it moves me every time I see it. I cry. And all the field staff cried, and it was just incredible. And then, you know, the other thing which I feel is so desperately important, raising awareness, yes, and we can do it through film and media and talk and books. We need to do more, a lot more, about films in local languages for the local people and making those films available to the local people. And some have been made in Uganda and some in Congo, Brazzaville, that are changing the local people and the kids particularly. And that's the last point I want to make, is the tremendous importance of involving young people and raising awareness. We can't, if we just did that now, that would be useless, because by the time they're grown up, the apes would have gone if that's all we do. We have to do a lot more than that. But we have to take the skills and the expertise of all the different people in this room together so that we can each work at what we know about, what we're passionate about, but have forums like this where all of those different expertises and skills can come together. And just one last word about young researchers, and there are some here. It can be daunting to think that you've got to get your degree and then you've got to learn all the list of things that you proposed. We do need young people who just care about learning about the apes, being out there and doing it. And we take from them and spread that out so that everybody can become aware. We don't have to burden every single young person with trying to do all that we've just said that we need to do.
Thank you. I'm just going to say at this point that at the express wish of all the panelists, they want this to be an open discussion. So if at any point any of you feel like adding a thought or contradicting or raising something, just sort of let yourself be known. Maybe we could have a little bit of light on the audience as well, so that we've got roving microphones and we can pass them around. So this is your discussion too. Just arising out of what we've heard, my first reaction would be, gosh, if you four wrote a letter to the CEO of Kellogg or the biggest of the oil palm companies with your names and credentials and expressed your opinions as the result of this meeting, wouldn't that be a pretty compelling letter asking them to take these things more seriously? Okay, Jane, why not?
I don't want us. Sorry, I don't want us to write a letter. I want us to go and have a meeting and look into their eyes and show them little bits of video and tell them stories and get into the heart. And a letter's not going to do it.
Okay, but it strikes me that... Sorry, please, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Maddie. I'm a Roots and Shoots youth leader. I've been campaigning the Girl Scouts in Kellogg for the past 7 years to adopt a responsible palm oil policy, and I want to invite all of you to come to Kellogg's with me and meet with the Girl Scouts. I just spoke with their Chief Sustainability Officer on Monday, and it's going to take a lot to get them further. The Girl Scouts just ended our conversation and said that the palm oil issue is over in their eyes after talking with them since 2011. So I want to invite each of you and you, Jane, to come and join because we need your help.
Well, I'm sorry, but I'm going to be somewhere else.
Russ?
That's a perfect lead-in for the point about oil palm that I wanted to make. And I just want to, first of all, I want to recognize the great effort that you've undertaken. It's spectacular to see someone your age engaged in this. I've always felt that large-scale agribusiness is the single greatest threat that we face, and I knew oil palm was an issue, but I've been hit in the face by the oil palm issue very strongly just in the past couple of weeks, because I was just in Kalimantan and in Sumatra. I visited one national park where 80% had been lost in the past 3 or 4 years through conversion to oil palm. Unbelievable. It's hard to fight oil palm because it produces after 3 years. It's an incredibly valuable product. It's easy to plant, but I think we need to get the point across that we don't want to have any more clearance of natural forest for oil palm plantations. There's plenty of degraded land. You can intensify production. They're getting 3 or 4 tons per hectare, I think, in Indonesia now. You can get up to 11 or even more. And I think it would be really good if our community could take a stand that we should not have any more clearance of natural forest for oil palm plantations.
How do you go about achieving that, Russ?
Well, there's a number of mechanisms. One is the round table on sustainable oil palm production and getting some of the big companies like Unilever and some of the others that are using, Kellogg's, that are using a lot of palm oil and get them to take this position. And I think even, you could probably even get some of the oil palm producers to adopt this policy. But I think we really need to draw a line in the sand right now, because otherwise we're going to see all of these remaining forests starting in Southeast Asia, moving to Africa, and it's starting in South America as well, whittled away over the course of the next 10 to 20 years.
When you say get them to, how do you get to them? How do you get that message to the most important people within those companies? Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Julie Stein from the Wildlife Friendly Enterprise Network, and I just wanted to offer forward one of the conversations I had with Goodall, with Michael before he left. He said Goodall had been approached to create a kind of a database where when you went in and did your Goodall profile, you could list your consumer preferences. And we're a certification body. We have the data, as do all the rest of the certification bodies, to feed into that system. He told me to go away and put the pieces together and come back and talk to him. We could do this for palm oil, both B2B and B2C, to start to create sustainable supply chains. So I'd like to make that happen as an outcome of this meeting, and I need everybody's help to do that.
We've been working on this issue quite a bit, and actually the largest palm oil producer in Indonesia has adopted a zero deforestation policy, which is being implemented with some bumps in the road, but is only as a result of hearing from those they had to sell to. Unilever, Nestle, Kraft, and a long list, frankly, of palm oil customers. None of those companies did it benevolently. None of them came to the table because they wanted to or were inspired, even if individuals within those companies did want to do that and were moved by these images and the stories that we told. They only did it because, quite frankly, they got their butts kicked. And I'm wondering if we know how to do this. There's all kinds of ways to set up sustainable supply chains. There's all kinds of experts to help them do that once they want to. But what's lacking, frankly, is motivation at this point. And so I guess it's an open question to the panel and to those in the room if we're willing to throw out some of the rules that we've used in the past, because frankly, time is running out. And if we're willing to shake the cages of these darn companies, because the government reforms won't come without industry moving first. So I'd love your thoughts on that.
I'll pass that to the panel. Doug?
One thing that comes to mind here is we're talking about an incredibly sensitive topic, palm oil, which has devastated Asia, is now beginning to devastate Africa. It's certainly a part of our lives, and we understand many of the complications that it's in this and this and this, right here in this room perhaps, and yet it's something that is destroying the natural world. And that is one important piece of activity that this room should certainly undertake, either individually or collectively. But I think it's also important, that's actually stopping something that's happening or blocking something that's happening. And I think we also have to think differently going forward, because we need to stop reacting to, stop playing defense and start playing offense, to use a sports metaphor. And I think that is another message that has come out of this conference repeatedly. Get into the planning process, get in early, but you have to get in early thinking differently. You can no longer regard this as an either or. You cannot block a government which owns its land and its apes from doing what it wants. You can influence the decision, and you can have an impact, and you can make a positive change in that way. But we have to begin to regard apes differently. And if I could for 1 second, at one point I was a sports writer for many years, so I do have a sports head on me for sometimes. Many sports now no longer regard athletes based on traditional values. Baseball players don't hit home runs anymore. There's a whole sabermetric revolution that transformed the way an athlete's skill was regarded. And no longer was it the big brawny guy that you went after, it was the smarter guy. It was the faster guy. It was different skills. We have to think differently about the way we regard great apes, because to every one of the 23 countries where they exist, they are a commodity, they are a natural asset, they will be capitalized, and if they're not capitalized upon, they'll be discarded because they weren't worth it. We have to start playing with some of those mentalities.
Okay, but Doug, can I just pick you up? Give us a specific example of how you put that into practice.
There's no better example than the one Russ mentioned earlier of mountain gorillas. They have valued themselves off the charts. They have made themselves impossible to ignore, impossible to destroy. They pay for themselves. And it's not necessarily pay as you go in every case. There are some areas of the world it would not work. But in many cases, with all of the different panels we've had in this Great Apes Summit, you can see where you can build a different case for great apes based on the values and the skills that were here, rather than the traditional save them because they're apes, because they're important, because they're apes. That's not a good enough argument anymore.
Yeah, I'd like to come back to my friend from Greenpeace. You're talking about Frankie Radaya, right?
Yeah, Golden Agri-Resources is the largest palm oil producer.
Yeah, we just got him on camera for about an hour, interviewed by Harrison Ford, talking about his...
I saw that.
Yeah, as part of a bigger program that we're doing on deforestation in Indonesia. Harrison also went in and read the riot act to the Minister of Forestry, because a day before he had been out in this national park, which doesn't have orangs but is critically important for elephants. This one that had been destroyed 80%. So I think we've got some good entry points there to really try to change the dynamic of the oil palm industry now. But the battlegrounds are really going to be Papua and Papua New Guinea, where you still have a lot of wilderness, the Congo, and the Amazon. In these other areas, you've got plenty of degraded land where you can put your plantations. But these wilderness sites, that's where the real battle is going to be.
Thank you, Brian. The tagline, new tools, new ideas, new voices, has been met. But I'm a bit concerned that the new tools and the new ideas and the new voices are largely dealing with traditional problems. So we're trying to hold back the tide. Better technology to monitor and do anti-poaching, new ideas for tackling the deforestation that is eating into the protected and unprotected areas, and, well, new voices, certainly some of them, young ones and some unexpected participants here. But it seems to be ignoring the wider discussion, the wider problems that we face, and I'm thinking particularly of climate change. You can have the best protected, best monitored, most loved, most profitable national park in the world, and the Virunga Conservation Area hits most of those boxes, but if it stops raining, the forest will die, the gorillas will die, and we're stuffed. And all the people who depend on that water tower of the mountains for their agriculture in the surrounding area, 600 people per square kilometre, stuffed. And yet, if we can put the the new ideas and the new tags and the new voices into the context that if we're going to stop dangerous climate change, and I'm sure you've all seen the climate models that show that if we hit 3 or 4 degrees increase in average global temperatures, the Congo Basin will be arid. The Amazon Basin will be largely arid, and Southeast Asia will be arid. To stop that from happening, we have to stop the deforestation. And the apes live in the forests and are central to the health of the forest. They're part of the forest. So the forest need the apes need the forest, and we need the forest to stop climate change. I'm surprised that climate change is hardly featured in our discussions, except in terms of RED, where we can get a bit of money to do these things better, solve the old problems better, but no one's thinking of that bigger picture, it seems. I know that some of that's not true. Many of you are deeply involved in this bigger picture, but that needs to be part of our thinking. I know UN GRASP is next door to UN RED. Fantastic. But where do we hear people saying that protecting apes, as you say, it's not because they're apes, because they have another more important value. Ecotourism is just one of them, but every ape that hasn't been visited by a tourist is working. And if we've lost 90% of chimpanzees, or gorillas, or elephants, we've lost 90% of the workforce that makes the factory of the tropical forest work for the world. And that's the message that doesn't seem to be coming out. So please add that to your bullet points, because we have to include climate change as part of our conversation. Saving the apes can be part of the solution to climate change, but climate change will stuff the apes along with every other species and ourselves if we're not successful.
Thanks, Ian. Jane, do you want to comment on the show so far?
Well, my comment I can strike off, because my comment was forests and climate change. Thank you. Ian, you've said it for me. It is tremendously important. The forests and the oceans, they are the great sequesters of CO2. That and the fact that more and more meat is being eaten, and this is causing clearance of forests for grazing or growing corn, as well as producing methane, which is an even more, I'm told, virulent gas than CO2. So protecting the forest is definitely going to be one of the instruments in slowing down. We can't stop climate change right now, but we can slow it down, or we do nothing and it gets worse. And then, as Ian says, we have arid Congo basins and arid Amazons and arid forests in other parts of the world. So, you know, protecting the forest is important for more than just saving apes, and that's what I think people have to get into their minds. And then the other thing, and let me finish this one, because you know, a lot of the problems, and I'm not talking about palm oil now, although in a way it relates to that, a lot of the problems are local people, human population growth. We hardly ever mention the expanding human populations, and that underlies so much of what's the problem in the world today. We could do everything we do if there were 1/10 of the number of people, and it wouldn't make any difference. But we have all these numbers of people, and they're cutting down the last trees because they've got to feed their family, or they've got to make a bit of money, so they want to do charcoal, or they want to do whatever it is they do, or they want to sell land to put palm nuts on it, you know? So alternative livelihoods. To me, that is tremendously important, and it's back to the importance of working with the local communities, which is what we've been doing since 1994, and it's paid off in that the forest is coming back. And all of that is wrapped up, and I only say, with the young people who get these new ideas, who do start thinking differently, and they can affect their parents. And that's why films directed to young people in the villages, in the local languages, is going to be a really, really key ingredient to saving the great apes.
I think we were all very inspired by the work that you've done in Gombe with returning the forests. I mean, I think that's a glowing example. Annette, what are your thoughts at this moment?
Well, I agree with, you know, obviously everything that's been said, but I would like to put the emphasis back on the integrated and collaborative approaches, because I just think that no one strategy is going to be enough. We're going to need reactions, where things are going wrong, and what we heard about today, fighting Kellogg or whoever it is exactly that. And we're also going to need proactive activities that are going to go into countries where we think palm oil is going to go, and start working with the government in a collaborative and constructive way to try and establish land use plans, no-go areas, and corridors to ensure that the most vulnerable and the most important places are protected. I think that it's very, very important that we make these links, and that's one of the reasons why I think this is a good conference. And as Jane, you were saying, the fact that we have had such diverse voices here means that the Girl Scouts can get in touch with Greenpeace and align and ally themselves and work together and collaborate, and that we can also involve the communities in the Leuther ecosystem, for example, who were brave enough to sue the company that was draining the peat swamps and planting palm oil, and support them because they put their lives and their livelihoods at risk in order to fight something that they felt was wrong. And it's all of those different initiatives together that will make a difference, and not any one of them on their own. So we need integrated approaches, and we need to have partners, and we need to be brave, as Rolf said from Greenpeace. We need to try some risky things. We need to shake the cage a little bit, and we also need to be constructive and diplomatic and work with governments and with companies and look for compromises. So that's a lot of skills, but I think they are all necessary.
Okay, sorry, yeah, Doug.
I was going to follow up with both what Annette was saying and what Ian said. In Ian's comments, this underscores exactly why this Great Ape Summit being twinned with Jackson Hole Wildlife Film Festival really works. Climate change is two words. We all say it, and I bet you most people cannot possibly describe it. You can't really get your hands around it. It's a very difficult story to understand, and it's an even harder story to tell. And we need to become better at telling that story. We need to be able to use the media at our disposal, and the media that will be coming in the future, to tell stories like that better. We have the worst word known to mankind, biodiversity. What does that mean? I mean, it's
here.
I know, I'm sorry. Look, I work at the UN. There are some times when we get reports that come through, and there's not a single paragraph without 10 acronyms, and I mean, it doesn't even make sense. But we've imprisoned ourselves in this speak that is making it impossible to reach the rest of the world and making it very easy to marginalize what we do. That's one comment. The second thing was, you're talking about palm oil has become, naturally, of course, one of the topics here. I just would say that in 30 some odd days from now, all of you have a choice. Your kids are going to put on sheets or are going to put on masks and walk around door to door for Halloween. It is a $2.4 billion industry in this country alone for Halloween candy, and I'm betting you $2.39999 billion of that is unsustainably sourced and probably bad palm oil. It has used bad palm oil in its production. You can't probably give away Nubia chocolates to everybody that came to your door. I'm sure Alexander would be happy if you did. But you have a choice, and that is where, as a consumer in this country, you can make a very simple choice that can affect everything else in Africa and Asia.
Could I just make a suggestion? Could it be that if you, as a group, collectively steered the public in that direction, could you not, I know you're reluctant to have a statement, a press release coming with this, but if people knew, I mean, your Halloween story is very dramatic, and Halloween affects everyone all over, certainly the Western world. Could you not help steer people in the right direction in quite concrete ways?
Why would we be reluctant to have a press release? Why do you say that?
I thought you were reluctant to draw a conclusion that might be, a statement or whatever.
I don't think we are.
Okay, good. Well,
I think we happily.
Is anybody?
What about a Halloween press release?
Yeah, we'll have a Halloween press release.
I think we need some kind of statement about oil palm, because the timing now is really, really good, given a lot of other things that are going on. But if I could come back to Ian's comment about what's that?
Nothing. It's inside.
Inside joke. Okay.
It's inside on this side of the room.
Okay. Coming back to Ian's comment about climate. Obviously, Ian, I've spent a whole lot of time on the climate change issue as well. But I think we've got a series of timing challenges facing us. Climate change is happening. The impacts are going to be felt pretty soon, but a bit down the line. We also need behavior change.
You mean for the apes? down the line. For some people feel them now.
Some people are feeling them now, but the dramatic impacts are still a little ways down the line. And behavior change is going to take some time. We have wonderful youth leaders, but between now and the time that you guys are going to be in leadership positions, we've got a gap. The threats are immediate, and I've been shocked recently at the speed of conversion of these natural habitats that are remaining. So that's why I keep coming back to the point, get them under some form of protection as quickly as possible, because a number of studies have shown even a paper park is better than no park at all. And if we don't get these areas declared, set aside in some way really soon, I think we're going to see everything that's not in the park disappear, and then the parks are going to start going already as well. So,
can I say something adding on to that? It's something that's been, this is just a crazy idea, but it's been coming to me as we've been talking and as we've heard comments from out there. One of these forests that's under threat, not yet, nothing's happened yet, right? But you know that there's this company and it's got its eyes on it and the government will probably capitulate, or the village management, whatever. If we use some of this amazing technology and we could estimate the number of trees that are there, roughly, I don't know how many thousands and thousands it would be, but with all the modern technology, the way we Facebook and Twitter, and there are thousands and hundreds of thousands of people. That's one of the problems. We've got too many flippin' people on the planet, and the educated people are growing. And, you know, so work it out to save this forest, to provide a little bit more than might be given to the government for selling it to palm oil. Say, okay, we have this number of trees. Each tree is going to cost that much. Twitter it out, tweet it out, send the money to somebody. And can we talk about the web of life?
I'd like to ask you as a group, do you feel, it's clear, you've been saying, each of you, the need for partnerships, for efforts bringing government bodies, industry, conservationists together. Do you feel that as 4 organizations, that you all coordinate your efforts sufficiently to achieve these ends? Because they're very ambitious ends, and if it requires partnership, do you feel you are partnering each other, and as much as you can, and with Greenpeace, etc., to achieve these ends? Russ? Doug?
I know, right. Well, amazingly enough, GRASP is a partnership, and the P in GRASP is a partnership, and I'm proud to say that Arcus and Conservation International and Jane Goodall Institute are all partners of GRASP. That doesn't mean that everything we do is collaborative every day. We do try to find overlap, and many of the organizations in the room are also, I mean, GRASP is 90 partners at this point, and will grow to more, I'm hoping. The idea was always, though, that each organization does what it does well, and where there's overlap or where there's possibilities for collaboration, we seize upon it. To have any project with 90 partners is probably doomed to fail, but there's specific areas where there is expertise, and we try and utilize that. I think we need to do more, and I think everybody in this room needs to do more. This industry has been so blinded over the years between with what it's doing and not collaborating traditionally. And some of that is professional, where you have information that you've been working on, it's your life's work, you don't want to share it. Some of it is territory, physically, that's my site, that's not your site. Some of it is organizations that don't get along. It's got to stop. I mean, it's just got to stop. There's no time for this. And I don't have a PhD. I barely got a bachelor's degree in, in Native American history, and I love it, but it doesn't really help me on this couch. But it doesn't mean that if I was getting a PhD, you shouldn't be an open book. You have to. And I think organizations have got to be more like that. They can be working side by side, and literally there's a line or a wall between them sometimes. And we know the result if we're going to go this direction, because you really can figure it out. It's going to be a few years, and it'll be over. We're going to have to change the way we do business. And whether it's collaborating inside GRASP or collaborating inside some of the funding pools that were talked about today at lunch, or any other of the sort of consortiums, IGCP, or even transboundary agreements or tripartite agreements, we're going to have to begin to harmonize this stuff much more aggressively and much more quickly, or it's game over.
Thank you. A question from the floor?
The RSPO, I think we've been sort of engaging with the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil for several years, and so have several other environmental NGOs, many of which are very small and very weak when you're confronted with Unilever and everybody else. some of which are bigger, Greenpeace and WWF. But for many years, I've thought that GRASP should be taking a role there with the RSPO. It should be engaging with the RSPO. Maybe we've not pushed that hard enough in the past because it was always seen as an Asian problem and the chimpanzee and gorilla people didn't really get it. But I think the time is probably ripe now to seriously engage with the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. I was thinking as well that this conference is piggybacked on the Jackson Hole Film Festival. Wouldn't it have been fantastic if it piggybacked on the annual Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil meeting? Because this meeting is attended, it's not attended necessarily by the scallies who are, you know, not following the rules. It's attended by the big players, the Wilmars, the Cargills, the Unilevers, government people in many respects. And you've got to remember that it's not Indonesians destroying Indonesia's forests, and it won't be Congolese destroying Congolese forests. It's American companies, it's European companies, and Australian companies. It just occurred to me that the RSPO is ripe for engagement, and it also includes climate change and destruction of peatlands and forests and REDD within its own agenda. So you can get a double whammy, perhaps.
Which brings me back to the question of the press release. I really hope that we make some sort of a statement, and I hope it includes some significant information on palm oil. And I think we're missing a great opportunity if we don't do that. And Jane, to your point about picking a particular area, I mean, the peat swamps are obvious places to focus on right now because they sequester so much carbon, because they're under the gun right now. And I think within 5 years, there probably won't be any peat swamps left if we don't really take rapid action now.
So are you going to draft a statement?
Sure.
Well, you know, it seems to me this is a great opportunity. You've got 4 united voices. You've got support from an entire floor here. This is the moment. I would draft it, and I think, you know, get everybody to sign it. You know, I would do it now if I was here. And, yeah.
Hi, I'm George Ledeck. I'm with World Bank. These comments are just my personal comments. It seems to me that part of what drives the boom in oil palm, or will be driving it, is the subsidized market for biodiesel, especially with incentives from the EU. And it's one thing to put palm oil into Girl Scout cookies or Halloween candies, but it's another when you start putting it into the tanks of vehicles and other machinery. That makes for an insatiable appetite. So part of where this links to climate change is that there are a lot of good ways to fight climate change, such as protecting forests and peatlands, and then there's some ways that are counterproductive that aren't climate friendly and are devastating to biodiversity, such as when you have a renewable energy standard. That sounds really good, but if that includes biofuels, then it's a problem, and it's better to call it a low carbon energy standard. And I think a lot of organizations, including my own, including the UN, including many conservation NGOs, have made that mistake. They've confused low carbon with renewable, and there are many technologies that are both, but biofuels is not one of them. And I think it's important to keep that distinction whenever we're talking about climate change and energy policy, and point out that biofuels in most cases are not climate friendly, and we know that they're not biodiversity friendly. So I urge everyone, keep that in mind whenever the issue comes up for energy policy or climate change, to go with low carbon energy rather than renewable energy as a standard.
Thank you very much. My name is Dominic Bikaba. I work for Strong Roots Congo in DRC. And I'm coming back on the palm oil in Asia. I know it's a matter of food and money. And I'm looking at it as we did in DRC with coltan, with gorillas and chimpanzees and people. And what we did, we tracked the chain of minerals from DRC and how they went in this high-tech product, telephones and everything. And we knew that we couldn't do anything on companies because they are strong, they have money and influence. We knew that the minerals was processed in South Asia, then sent the particles in Europe and in US. Then we want to reach the companies in US. The only one way was to touch the government in US. And we testified before the Congress, US Congress, in May 2010. And fortunately, the president signed the law that was called conflict minerals the same year. And as you can look at DRC today, this situation of coltan can still be, but not like it was some years ago. And what helped us actually was the media, because activists in Washington, in Congo, and everywhere, we went together raising our voices. And I'm looking at it the same way for palm oil. I agree that companies can do agriculture, extensive agriculture, it's smart of food, it's smart of money, and the government in Asia are involved. But what we need is that those companies are aware and accountable for their activities in Asia. What we need, if they cannot really stop what they are doing, we have to raise our voices and do anything we can to either stop them or close them, because we cannot accept that we lose all the orangutans and their habitat. We saw the slide here, how orangutans were like, I cannot tell. We cannot allow companies to continue doing that. We have to do our best to stop them. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone like to comment on that? I think there's a general agreement on that, absolutely. Sorry, Greenpeace.
Yep, sorry to speak twice, but speaking of general agreement, there's near consensus among advocacy organizations who have been working on palm oil for many years and have engaged their RSPO in a very frustrating way for many years. What needs to happen next? So if you are considering a statement from this group, I'd be happy to share the main elements, the building pieces of that, because the RSPO currently is not the solution. An increasing number of companies understand that. They need to move beyond the RSPO just to shield themselves from the risk that's in their supply chains. And there's no mystery what needs to happen. It's very clear, and like I said, there's basically consensus among advocacy groups right now, so I'd love to share that humbly before we try to reinvent the wheel.
Okay. I've been told I got one more question, but actually I'm going to be really cheeky and ask two. First of all, we're here, courtesy of Jackson Hole Film Festival. These are largely filmmakers. What, briefly, in sort of 10 seconds or less, what should the filmmakers be doing that they're not doing now to help you achieve your goals? Annette?
I would like very much for them to help us tell the story better, because I don't think conservationists and scientists have told the story very well so far. As Doug was saying, biodiversity and all the other jargon words that we use just don't communicate particularly well. But I would also like to ask the filmmakers to help us, or for us to help them, figure out how to tell the story in its complexity, because it's just too simple the way it's portrayed in the media. And, you know, we had a presentation earlier today where they were saying broadcasting is going down the plug hole. And that's because everything is so simplified, and it's in sound bites, and it's just doesn't tell people the truth. And it makes people feel that there are single issue solutions, simple solutions to the problem. And they aren't simple, and they have to be, people have to be much better educated about all these issues. So we need help to communicate, but we need the communication to be real and to reflect what the real issues are.
Doug, briefly?
Yes, I would certainly agree with Annette. Sorry, I just learned her name finally after knowing you for how many years? I've been calling her Annette since I don't know when. Annette, I agree with that exactly. I would also add on top of that, help us understand the future better. I think most people in this room that are conservationists still think that a documentary that airs on BBC or that maybe plays on Animal Planet is going to help you change the world. I hate to break it to you, those days are gone. It is much more instantaneous, and unfortunately it is sound bites to some degree, and there's so much more technology, as if you were here last night with Michael Jones. There's technology coming out there that we can't even wrap our heads around yet, and it may be the difference for us. Bring us along with you as you begin to explore these areas. We have compelling stories to tell, but perhaps we can tell them in a different way with your new technology. I'd like to have that opportunity.
Russ?
I would say just do more. I mean, it's amazing when I go back 24 years and think how small this festival was and how few people relatively were working on doing wildlife film. And when I see what's happening here and the quality of the products, it's phenomenal. So the more you can produce, the better, because it's a great tool and helps enormously.
Thanks. Jane?
Well, there's not really much to add except that I know from personal experience when I first began studying the chimpanzees of Gombe, and I went to Cambridge University and I was told chimps didn't have personalities, minds or feelings, only we did. It was Hugo van Lawick and the National Geographic films that went around and changed people's attitudes. People began to understand. And I think the big problem with filmmakers today making these really powerful films is lack of funding. They're struggling. So it's no good us turning to all of you and saying do more, because we have to find money for you to do more, or you have to find money. And it's a chicken and an egg. You've got to change attitudes by film, but unless you change attitudes, you won't get the money to make more film. So it's a vicious circle, but at the same time, tremendously, tremendously important. And just to end again, I've said it before, but I'll say it again, films to reach the local people in the range countries, films made specifically to reach Chinese children, Chinese businessmen, and change the way the film is written and the commentary's done, more diversity.
Here comes my last cheeky, snuck-in question. Starting with you, Jane, there must be one thing you've come across in the last few days that has inspired you, that has made you feel it's going to work, it can be okay. What was that for you?
For me, it was the amazing people I've met, the people I've talked to. There's a feeling of, yes, it's a gloomy time, but we're damn well not going to let them defeat us. We are going to win. That's why I use a swear word on purpose. I could use more. We are not going to give up. We will continue. There's inspiration out there, and I'm inspired.
Russ?
I'm afraid I'll have to repeat the same thing that Jane said. It's this sense of optimism that comes out of this group. In spite of all the problems, in spite of all the challenges, this feeling of optimism is really terrific. And how many people in the last session raised their hands when they said, who's optimistic? Almost everybody put their hands up. We can't be defeated by this. We have to remain on target.
And more than optimistic, pig-headedness.
Pig-headed.
We're obstinate.
We're all pig-headed, that's for sure.
Thought to add?
If you're being cheeky, I'll be cheeky back. I got a 1 1/2-er, okay? The half one is, this is just one of those serendipitous things. I was talking to a guy yesterday, and he works here at the ski resort, and he had heard some of the discussions about orangutans and fractured habitat. He said, why don't you just string up lifts? Why don't you just connect them with lifts? It's simple. We do it all the time. And if you can put a lift up that hill, you could certainly string together habitat. Maybe it sounds kind of crazy, but I liked it because it was crazy. And there's not a lot of that being done. There are some zip lines in places across rivers and whatnot, but he was ambitiously talking about trying to find ways to connect habitat. The other thing I would say is that this group over the last 4 days has graciously brought in and welcomed a lot of voices and ideas that were not traditionally part of ours. And it flipped some of our thoughts, our paradigms on its head. It offered some opportunities and inspiration that wasn't there before. And today, or yesterday actually, or no, 2 days ago, geez, sorry, talking with Serge Wish, who is the Scientific Commission of GRASP's chair, he said, why don't we take all these great ideas, pull them together, and just intensely focus them on a site that needs it desperately now to prove that new ideas and new commitment can make a difference. And there's certainly places in the world that are on the precipice right now of going away. And I don't care whether it's cross-river gorilla habitat in Nigeria and Cameroon, or whether it's the Loiser ecosystem in Sumatra. There are places that are in desperate need of the collective force and ideas here. And I would love it if this room were to come together in that way and say, all right, we'll drop all our gloves. We're going to do this together. And we can make a difference and prove that we can make a difference. That kind of possibility gives me hope.
Okay. Annette?
Well, Annette, that's right, you got it wrong. It's okay. I think for me, something that really came out in this meeting and inspired me is Alain Farma, who is a customs official from Burkina Faso. And he came to the Great Ape Summit and gave a presentation about what he is doing. And it made me stop in my tracks and realize, you know, these are the different voices that we need to bring to the table. And the fact that the population in Leith sued Kalista Alam, the big palm oil company, because they were draining the peat swamps. And they took enormous risks to do that. Those are the things that inspire me. The fact that there are very different people with completely different backgrounds and viewpoints, but they're our allies, they're our strongest partners, and I find that terribly exciting because I think that does give me hope.
On that note, I'm going to end this session and thank our distinguished panelists and thank you all for raising your voices as well.